Cheers, Marcus. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. So myself and Vicky are going to kind of perform a bit of a tag team presentation based on a study that we have conducted over the last kind of 12 to 18 months and recently had published in Sport Education Society. So the paper is called Transforming Whose Lives, the Portrayal of International Sport Development Volunteering by UK Higher Education Institutions. And I guess just to kind of set a bit of context, set a bit of tone, I think it's really important to kind of start today's seminar by just saying that we are essentially aware of what this kind of paper is doing. We are kind of poking the bear with a stick, and the bear being higher education, and us both working within higher education. So we are aware that this paper is probably starting quite an uncomfortable academic conversation. So I guess that was just a bit more of kind of context, really. Sorry. Can everybody hear me okay? Just have a message from Chris Cutler to say
it's struggling a little. Is it if you've got the headset and microphone? I'm just wondering whether the position on your microphone, maybe you can adjust that. I'm not sure.
Is that the best one?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay. It's a little bit quiet.
I can hear you, Joe. I can hear you. It's just the sound quality is not great.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay, so that's where we are. We're essentially setting up quite a critical conversation of the sector in which we kind of work, and a sector in which personally I've been involved in as a practitioner, kind of setting up sport for development opportunities for university students. So we are kind of critiquing these kind of practices. So in terms of moving us on to what we're going to focus on today, the study aim and purpose was to essentially to investigate how sport and volunteer tourism and how these opportunities are portrayed by universities across the UK, to also explore any benefits associated with this kind of volunteer tourism, benefits to students and benefits to universities. I think really to start this critical conversation, to really challenge the way in which the HE sector portrays sport, volunteer tourism, and as I've already alluded to, to kind of have this conversation started, be quite critical of the sector. Why are we doing this? Well, there's a lack of critical research. It's a growing sector, the use of sport, volunteer tourism. It's an area that's been growing, and universities are kind of part of that growth. There's a lot of existing research out there that does focus on the benefits to students, and this study really tries to broaden it out a little bit. And like I said earlier, just to begin to challenge universities how they might prepare students better for these kind of experiences, and how they might consider portraying international volunteerism a little bit differently based on some of our findings. So some of the key terms, just to kind of set the tone, some of the kind of key terms that our study draws on. First of all, volunteer tourism, which for those of you that are unaware is an emerging trend which combines travelling and volunteering, which is linked to the idea of doing good and helping those that are less fortunate. Also, sport for development, that's the kind of sector, the broader sector in which combines the power of sport and kind of sport-based programmes to tackle non-sporting objectives, so issues to do with poverty, broad social issues, often in developing countries or in poorer nations around the world, which brings us on to the kind of dynamic between the global north and the global south, which, as I'm sure all of you are aware, this kind of social political division, which kind of was made popular back in the 1980s to try and identify higher and lower income countries, which historically could be linked back to power inequalities and colonialisation. And then fourthly, higher education really, and the kind of shift in the last few years or maybe decade or so in terms of how higher education is marketed. You know, students now being as consumers, graduate employability is a key driver. We've got this neoliberal practice of privatisation and this idea of selling a international development opportunity, of which we'll kind of come on to in terms of our study. And so some of the kind of context, some of the literature that we've drawn on to kind of form the bedrock of our study is quite critical literature that essentially gives us the same kind of messages, in that sport for development practices need to be more considerate of localized voices. They need to decolonize the sector. This idea of helping others that are less fortunate comes with it lots of broad stereotypes, with white saviour complex. There's a lot of volunteer tourists are privileged white Westerners. That is a generalisation, but that is generally what the academic critical literature tells us. And actually, we need to go beyond the kind of superficial benefits to students and actually consider what long-term impact and potential negative impact this kind of volunteerism might have on local communities. And I guess just to kind of juxtapose that, what we also have is that universities are now wanting to develop students as individuals into global citizens. And this whole idea of volunteer tourism and using sport as a vehicle is quite an attractive way for universities to kind of tick these boxes around helping students become a global citizen, helping them to develop their own skill set and their kind of global outlook, which are kind of key graduate attributes. So this is the kind of study context that we find ourselves in. I'm not going to say too much more about the key literature. I think I've touched on that already there, Vicky. So what I hope I've done there is, for the first few minutes, just kind of set up the purpose and the rationale for the study. And then Vicky's now going to take us through the methodology, and then we'll talk through the results and discussion between us.
Thanks, Jo. So I came to this with an interest because I am a sports development officer at heart. That's certainly my background. And then when I started at Hallam, I supervised a number of placements where students went internationally with an organisation that we might not necessarily promote, but we allow it onto campus to talk to our students. And some of the feedback from the students, to be honest, it wasn't that great, and I was a bit disappointed in the experiences that they'd had. So when Jo asked if I wanted to work with her on this, I was really keen to get involved. So our methodology was centered around template analysis, which is a form of thematic analysis, and we were using externally facing web-based content. So that was things like university websites, student union websites, and any kind of social media platforms that had a link to a university. So so things like Hallam has a Go Global Facebook group that's externally facing that anybody can join. And we selected 13 UK higher education institutions. So one from Northern Ireland, one from Scotland, one from Wales, and then an equal distribution geographically across England. And we set the criteria of they must offer international sport for development opportunities. They must have searchable content available to us. They must be based in the UK, and we were looking for an even geographical spread. And then Jo and I individually, we took six and seven of the institutions each, and we went through and did a thematic analysis on the content that we had found, and then we cross-checked each other's to establish our preliminary code book. And once we'd established that, we then went back and retested and looked again at each other's work and reapplied that preliminary code book to get to our final code book. This was a really interesting methodology for me, not something I'd really done before. So and definitely something I think students could apply in some of their projects. Perhaps that's something we need to look at for future projects. As a result of the final code book, we came across two really distinct tracks in the data that we'd found, and we're going to talk to you about those now. So the first one was the benefits to students, which Jo will take you through, and then I will take you through the higher institution-led discourse.
Okay, great stuff. So yeah, as Vicky's just said there, I'm going to talk us through our first kind of key area when we've looked through the data and analysed the data using template analysis. We very much separated out our results and discussion in terms of student-led discourse. So these are kind of blogs, reflective posts, the words of students, how they describe their sport for development and volunteer experiences and how it's kind of benefited or transformed their lives. So the kind of key things that were coming out was how this opportunity had helped their perceived, that's probably a key word, perceived employability skills. The helping imperative is kind of a key draw why they got into this opportunity. They felt that they were personally developed, they had their skills were developed through this opportunity. They valued their experience of what they understood through cultural immersion, and from a social capital point of view, really kind of there was a lot of detail within the data talking about the idea of networks and groups that were formed as a result of this opportunity have benefited them as individuals. So the whole idea that networks hold value. And so the first theme within the student-led discourse was about the development of personal skills. And the students from the data that we looked across had visited a number of different countries in the global south. This example here is focusing on their experience in the Gambia, and very much just kind of position their experience that it's going to be really helpful for their CV, this idea that it's a CV builder. And it can help them find their dream job after they graduate. So kind of thinking ahead about how that experience can benefit them in the future. Multiple examples. This is just one that was pulled out of the data set. It's quite illustrative of others. The second thing that was really apparent was this idea about being part of something much bigger, so being a global citizen, almost putting their own lives back in the UK into some sort of context, and this kind of experience of exploring and immersing themselves in another culture allowed them to kind of feel they were part of something bigger. You can see from the quote here, my trip away to Fiji was honestly the best experience of my life. I learned that the world is different and it's important to explore other cultures. So, with that, you've kind of got these students really feeling like they're benefiting, they're gaining an awful lot from this opportunity that has been afforded to them via their universities. Vicky?
So the second clear discourse that we found in our data set was very much a university-led discourse. So I've just put in the title there. There was a real theme of, by attending this course, you will, or by attending this university, you will. And it was very much to focus on the opportunities that universities provide to their students. And it really felt very much like it was being used as a promotional tool to inform and attract potential new students. So there's a couple of quotes there around volunteering programs being significant and memorable experience, could be, so you could go. It can be one of the most rewarding experiences of your life, hugely beneficial for you and the community you visit. Throughout all of the information on the website, clear links to employability. So, and very much from a university perspective, and I believe that comes out of like government policy around higher education leads to economic success and more likely to be employable. Employability is a really strong theme in current government strategy around higher education, but things like having transferable skills. One university talked about standing out from a crowded graduate market, CV building, developing your networks for the future, all very much key messages. I kind of, when we looked at the data set, I almost asked who was it targeting, because it almost felt like it was aimed at parents. Send your child here and they will develop all these transferable skills, and we offer this amazing opportunity to go to the Gambia or Fiji or whichever the trip was. And lots of references to student leadership, global. We produce global citizens. There was a really strong theme through all of the content around the university attaching itself to these students. So our students off this course have been and done this experience, and it has developed them as more employable graduates. It very much from a promotional discourse. So the question that we were left with when we went through this part of the data set was, if in a crowded higher education marketplace, because we are in a crowded higher education marketplace, and we are vying for effectively the same students as our competitors, are we selling a student experience but with little or no consideration for local voice and ethical underpinning? Because across both of the data sets, I don't like, there was a real me theme about it. So I've developed this, I'm a better person, I've got more CV, I've helped this poorer country develop, and very little recognition of local voice, community input, even very little recognition of, I've changed. There was a real theme of I've changed the world in my visit, but very little recognition of actually have you, and what impact do we have in just 4 weeks. So yeah, do you want to move on to the next slide, Joe? So we came to a series of conclusions and recommendations in the paper. And as Joe said right at the beginning, we are very aware that this is kind of poking the bear a little bit, but that we feel that universities, as a centre of production for knowledge, but also the dissemination of that knowledge, we should be maybe more questioning of the approach that we take. And I should just say, Joe and I are both extremely supportive of sending students abroad. We really believe in the value of that experience, but we just feel we have a bit of a responsibility to perhaps consider it differently. So should we be more responsible in the promotional use of volunteerism stories? So should we be encouraging students to take selfies with locals just to post all over their social media? Don't know. We need to look at finding a better way of recording and celebrating that local voice. So one of our reviewers on the paper said that there wasn't actually any evidence that universities, we called it, what did we call it, Jay? We called doing due diligence. And he said that there was no evidence that universities weren't doing due diligence. And he's absolutely right. But there's also no evidence that they are. And that's the critical thing that's missing. We should be celebrating our engagement with local voice if we are doing it. We should want to develop not only globally experienced students, so we don't just want global citizens, we want globally responsible students. We need to take it as an opportunity to be more involved with education for sustainable development. And this is something that is very much part of higher education's landscape at the moment. We should want to be involved, and Hallam could be the leading voice in developing some sort of ethical standard for partners involved in student-focused volunteerism. And we do need to ask the question, whose lives are we transforming? Are we sending privileged Westerners to the global South to transform their own lives? Or are we actually having a positive impact on the communities that we are sending these young people to? Joe, do you want to finish us off with our future plans?
Yeah, sure. I think this is still a kind of work in progress, and how this paper evolved is just some kind of willingness and some kind of shared kind of views. So again, if there's anybody kind of keen to jump on board and kind of feed into this, please do. But where we're thinking is, moving this kind of piece in the future is looking at the kind of widening participation agenda, or which higher education students do take up this kind of opportunity. For example, you know, how open is the offer? Maybe looking at the profiles of students who do take up this kind of opportunity, looking at their socioeconomic background, that kind of what their journey is. I think there's a real key opportunity here for us to help decolonise the curriculum. There's some content that I think is shared across a lot of the programmes that we deliver within the academy, and there's some opportunities here for us to decolonise the curriculum. Look for some good examples of practice. I think there's a bigger piece of work, even bigger piece of work, as Vicky said, around possibly trying to develop an ethical standard for Hallam and the partners that it works with, allowing students to travel to the global south. And again, I think there's a piece of work that could be done there. We could really be at the forefront of the sector, acknowledging that this is a growing sector, that there are critiques of practice, but actually trying to do something positive about them. And yeah, trying to actually seek out what these opportunities of current good practice are, because we're not saying everything that higher education institutions are doing is terrible. We're not saying that by any stretch, but so we're trying to look at opportunities to identify the good practice and share and celebrate that, as well as, you know, trying to generate this ethical standard, this ethical framework, so we're kind of moral higher education institutions that are taking responsibility for promoting and sending the students into the environments and consider what their kind of long-term impact, positive and or negative, could be to kind of host communities. So I think that's it for the formal presentation, Vicky, unless you want to add anything.